when international aid agencies embark on reconstruction projects in post-conflict countries, I think they traditionally think in terms of 4 planning stages: prioritising needs, making a plan, getting the resources, and then getting the job done. At each stage, getting input from the local population is considered a good thing, but ultimately the planning work tends to be put in the hands of experts, either experts within the government or frequently foreign technical advisors, the sort of advisors that AusAid and all other international aid agencies supply to post-conflict governments on a very regular basis. Now, recently there has been a rethinking of this strategy to some extent on the basis that expert plans don't always work out unless there is some kind of local commitment to the project, and this is exactly what the Dili Declaration and other recent aid declarations have tried to express. I mean, poor people generally, if they're offered a development project, they will generally accept it and they will generally refrain from criticising it, even if they can see fundamental flaws in its design. And development experts, I think, for a long time have been very good at giving poor people things that those poor people might quite like but don't really need, and maybe even find it difficult to actually use them productively. So this has led to greater interest among development agencies in the business of politics. How do you successfully mobilise people around planning, around making goals, around implementing policy decisions? And why is it that some organisations manage to do this so successfully while others conspicuously fail? What can aid agencies learn from these kinds of successes? Now, in the Asia Research Centre at Murdoch University, there's a team of us at the moment, including Jane and myself, who are currently working on looking into these issues in collaboration with AusAid in an attempt to try to find better ways for aid agencies to engage with local populations. And one of the key issues that we're addressing is what should be the relative roles of experts and politicians, opinion leaders. How do opinion leaders forge coalitions in support of their policies? And how should aid agencies try to tap into or orient themselves towards the influence of these kinds of opinion leaders? Now, certainly experts have a role to play in post-conflict reconstruction. Experts can offer models of how things might work. We've caught up with the slide now. They can offer options and technical assistance for implementation. But expertise comes with its own aura of power, and no one, in my experience, is more impressed by that aura of power than the expert themselves. I work in a university which is full of experts, and I can tell you this from experience. Experts are rather too happy to think that their expertise entitles them to call the shots. And we found, looking at aid programmes and documents that we've reviewed in the course of our study, we found this tendency creeps in again and again. So we want to draw attention to the important role that opinion leaders play. And I would characterise the input of opinion leaders as follows. They can provide things like the ability to make compromises and accommodations, to build coalitions of support, to mobilise money, other kinds of resources, energy from the population. And these are the sorts of things that without those, without somebody there, without several people there who can do that, aid projects become much more difficult to deliver. The question remains then is how can opinion leaders and experts be best combined to create workable policy? And I think this is where the politics comes in. Opinion leaders acquire influence by having ideas and resources, which they may get from foreign experts, but they also need a platform, a political platform. They need a political network, somebody to spread those ideas, to take those ideas out to possibly very remote parts of a post-conflict country. They need a basis on which they can start to negotiate with contenders about those ideas and about how those goals might be implemented. And they need to use all those things to build a coalition of support behind particular types of strategies. The problem is, what happens when influential opinion leaders don't agree with expert opinion, or have to respond to powerful constituencies that don't agree with expert opinion? All the foreign education experts in Timor will agree that the learning of catechism should be optional in the curriculum to conform to commitment to a secular state and freedom of religion in Timor's constitution. However, the Church's opposition to this dealt a serious blow to the legitimacy of the government when it tried to insist upon a more secular strategy, because the Church was, in fact, a more influential opinion leader than the government at the time and had opposing interests. Taking politics seriously as a determinant of successful aid policy implies that experts stand back and let political actors come to their own accommodation on these issues, even if that accommodation leads to an outcome that we might not think is the best one. Now, this can lead to profound dilemmas of principle for donors and foreign taxpayers, and this is the sort of final point that I want to end on. I think my answer to the question of how Australia can help post-conflict countries is for us to think about shifting from a paradigm of expertise, which we've been very comfortable with for a long time, towards a paradigm of solidarity. And that implies, I think, a number of sort of do's and don'ts, which seem quite straightforward, but are actually quite difficult for agencies like AusAid, accountable to people like us, to realise. I think there's a list of do's and don'ts that I'm going to leave you with, which I think arise from this, and perhaps we can discuss whether what the kinds of dilemmas that these are likely to raise. In terms of don'ts, we don't assume that we know the answers. Don't assume all post-conflict countries are the same. Don't assume that expertise is more important than leadership or opposition. Don't assume that leaders have the coalitions and networks in place that they need to get things done, particularly if we've put them in that leadership position. Do's. Do remember that every workable plan is a compromise and that the space needs to be there for those compromises to be made. The rigid and sort of doctrinaire application of policy prescriptions causes immense difficulties for politicians attempting to build support. Do remember that too much external direction stifles political accommodation. And do remember that leaders need those coalitions of support if they're going to get anything done. And that means they need to spend as much time talking to their own people as they need to spend talking to us. And the implications of those do's and don'ts are that we have to think about aid in fundamentally different ways. I think in terms of building relationships rather than achieving outcomes. Prioritising accountability to locals rather than accountability to ourselves. And prioritising building... sorry, I've said that twice, and letting the receivers of aid set the agenda, even if we don't like what they come up with. This is difficult, and I think we have to be prepared to either put up with outcomes of which we disapprove, or think about withdrawing or supporting, perhaps, alternative groups in that case. These dilemmas are increasingly real for aid agencies all over the world operating in post-conflict environments, but what I think we need to accept as Australians in Australia who are funding some of these aid agencies is that this is a dilemma that we have to be prepared to face too, and we have to think about what we want our relationship with people in post-conflict countries to look like. And I hope that we'll have a chance to discuss that a little bit in the question and answer session. Thanks very much.